Hi there, Sugar Snaps. Welcome to the studio. If you're new here, welcome in. My name is Brittany and welcome to the Textile Indie YouTube channel. I share basket weaving, natural dyeing, spinning, wet felting, and other fiber arts on this channel and on my website, textileindie.com. Be sure to check out the description below for links and resources and all the materials and tools we'll be using in today's tutorial. Today I am sharing another part of my pine needle basketry series. This is a project I've been working on through the month of January to experiment and explore and learn more about pine needle basketry. So pine needles are used in coil basketry, where you're taking a coil and you're winding it around and stitching it down with some sort of thread or twining or raffia or something like that. It's a slower process, a slower basketry technique, because you're going up at a 1/4 inch increments and you're stitching every 1/4 inch. So you're moving fairly slowly. So the project that I'm going to share today is going to be a small jewelry plate. And this would be great for on your bathroom counter or by your bed to store your rings or smaller pieces of jewelry. And the point of doing this is to practice your pine needle basketry stitches, experiment with some different stitches, how to manage a coil and a bundle of pine needles, and it allows for less pine needles. So if you're out harvesting or gathering or foraging pine needles in your area, you don't need as many for this project because it's smaller. So about a handful will be plenty. Be sure to check the description below for all of the other videos in this series, as well as my blog post that has all the information you need on pine needle basketry. And you'll see in the eye up here videos from throughout the series will pop up there as well. So without further ado, let's get started weaving our pine needle basket. Now, the first step in pine needle basketry is to gather your pine needles. And I went over that in this video up here, so be sure to check that out up here or in the description below and go through the process of finding pine needles that are intact. The pine needles typically come in 2 or 3 sections. So there's 3 pine needles together in a cap. And the cap looks like this right here. So this piece holds multiple pieces of pine needle together. You want the lengths of the pine needles to be 5 inches or more in length so that you have a good, nice length to work with. Otherwise, you're adding more pine needles to your bundle as you go more frequently. Once you have them gathered and you've chosen some that aren't mildewed or discolored in a bad way, then you'll want to wash and clean, and if you want to dye them, you can dye them. I have some examples of dyed pine needles here. I have a dark brown, coral, purple, navy blue or teal blue, and this sort of slate brown color, slightly different than the natural color of the pine needles. And you can check out this video here and the description below for how to dye your own pine needles and the process that I like to use. So now I'm assuming you have your pine needles prepared, washed, cleaned, ready to go, and they have been soaking in water for about 15 minutes to soften them. So I have a bin here that I put in my pine needles, and I made sure to lay them out so that the heads are on one end, or the ends that have the cap are on one end, and they are laying in my bin. And I've soaked this for 15 minutes. The water is no longer too hot to touch, but it was boiling when I initially poured it in here. And that's to soften up the pine needles and allow them to be as flexible as possible. All your pine needles have been in the water for 15 minutes. It's time to take off these pine needle caps. And you can leave them on, but they add bulk, and for this project I want to remove them so that they're not in my way. So you'll come and you'll hold the pine needle close up to the end where this cap is, right here, and I'm going to use my thumbnail to pull this off. And it comes off pretty easily if the ends have been soaking in the water for a good amount of time. So then you have a lighter end here, and you can add that to your water bin. So you'll come in and you'll clean off all of the caps, scraping them off like so, and adding these to your water bin. And this is quite the process. Pine needle basketry is not a fast craft. It's definitely a slow craft. So just turn on a TV show or a movie, or go into your head and zen out, listen to an audiobook, something like that. and clean up the ends of your pine needles. And again, for this basket, I want a bundle that's about a grip's worth. So if you round your thumb and your forefinger around, you have a bundle that's about this big. And I'll be adding this small bundle here to it as well. If you come across pine needles that are cracked like this, set these aside. You can add them to a compost bin, but I wouldn't use them in your basket. That broken piece will mean you'll have to add more pine needles more often, and that crack just won't improve the quality of your basket or the texture of your basket. It will cause some roughness on the surface of your basket. Once all your pine needles are soaked and the tips have been cleaned off so that they're nice and smooth, you're ready to start coiling your basket. When I'm coiling a pine needle basket, I like to set up my workspace similar to how I would set it up for a rattan basket weaving, by laying out a towel on my work surface. Because I'm doing a smaller basket, I don't need a big towel. I'm just using a hand towel folded in half. And then I have pliers, a pair of scissors, the twine that I'm going to use. This is imitation sinew in kind of a golden brown color. I'm going to use this length of drinking straw as my gauge because I'm doing something small, so a 1/4 inch diameter is perfect. You can see in this video here, I wove a vase pine needle basket using this gauge. This is a piece of cardstock layered in duct tape that I used as a gauge. This is about 1/2 inch across in diameter, so it's quite a bit bigger than my straw piece, but it worked well for the size of basket that I was using for the vase. So when you are picking a gauge to hold your pine needles, you want something that's going to be equivalent to the size of the finished product, because if you used a really small gauge and you're coiling a larger basket, one, the thickness of the basket is going to be really thin and really flimsy, but two, it's going to take a very long time to coil 1/4 inch at a time, 1 stitch at a time. And you'll see that later. It's just a very slow process. So balancing the size of your gauge with the size of the basket is really helpful. And you can find resources for brass versions of these pine needle basket gauges in the description below if you want something a little more sophisticated than a drinking straw. Now the purpose of the gauge is to hold your pine needle bundle together as you're working with it. So grab out a few pine needles and you want to make sure that all of the ends here are lined up or going in the same direction. And I'll bundle a few of these up, tap them together, and then stick them into the end of this straw. And I'm trying to get a bundle that will fit through the straw and will slide nice and smoothly. And you can add more to see if it can use a little bit more. That's not going to fit through. So I have a good number of pine needles at this point. From here, I'm going to start with my thread, cut off a piece, and I am starting my basket with a wrapped coil base. If you want to have something in the center of your basket to wrap around, like a split walnut or a circle of wood, there are lots of pine needle base techniques that you can start out with. I like doing this one because it means I don't need an added piece of material. So I'm going to create a square knot in the end of this thread by wrapping both ends up, crisscrossing so that one's underneath, and the end that's underneath I'm going to stick down and through the loop so that I have a pretzel, like so. And now this loop I'm going to take and place over the ends of the pine needles and pull tight. And I want them about 1 inch from the end here, like so. And now slide your gauge down a bit, and you can come in and add more pine needles to keep it nice and tight. I'll just tuck a few in here. And now pull this end over so that it's in line with the pine needles. And we're going to start wrapping, pulling tight on where we created that knot, wrapping around the pine needles and making sure to embed this length of thread underneath our wraps. So I'm wrapping nice and tight, creating a tube, layering the edges of the twine right up next to each other. And you can do this with raffia or waxed linen. I like using this imitation sinew. It's a polyester thread, but it has a waxy surface to it, so it grips nicely and it has a good gauge to work around without doing thousands upon thousands of wraps. So I'm going to continue wrapping until I have 1.5 inches wrapped in this pine needle. And as you work, you'll notice that you'll be sliding the gauge up the length of the pine needles and out of your way. And as you do that, you'll be working up the length of the pine needle, which means that every once in a while you want to go in and tuck a new pine needle into the middle of the bundle. So I'm trying to hide this end that was under the pine needle cap, tuck that into the middle so that it gets hidden and absorbed into the coil without sticking out and causing a unevenness in the surface of the pine needle coil. And if you let go of your strand, it does start to become loose. So try to keep tension on the string as you wrap it. And if you need to take a break, grab a clamp or a binder clip or something that can hold it in place. Okay, so I have about 1.5 inches here. Now I'm going to come up with my scissors and take these ends and trim them down so I just have 1/8 of an inch sticking out, and that's not very much off the end. You can toss the scraps. And this end, I'm holding on to my tail here, and I'm going to fold this end around and up. So I have about 1/2 inch of length here, and then coil this around. And this is why you want your pine needles to be nice and damp. If you do this when the pine needles are dry, they'll just crack right away. So we do this when they're damp and super pliable. And now I have a coil here where I folded over the end and it's in the center, and I'm wrapping this around like so. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this to the outside and then come in with my length of twine here. I've looped the thread through my tapestry needle, and I have a short tail and then one that's longer. Bring your needle through the edge here and all the way through to the other side. And if you need to, you can grab your pliers. Pliers are really helpful in this part of the basket because it's pretty stiff. So having the pliers to help pull the thread through is very helpful, thread and the needle. So then pull through so you have about a 5-inch tail. And now I'm going to stitch over just a bit. So I came out right here. I'm going to stitch over right here, like so. Make sure you catch the center coil. You can use your pliers to push the needle through as well. This first several stitches is pretty tough because you're working through a lot of layers and the pine needles are really tight. So I'll pull this through, and now that's going to hold my coil more together. So I'll tie this end, my original end, with the end I just pulled through. Tie a square knot nice and tight to hold that in place. Like so. And now this end I'm going to loop back around and into the base and tuck the end in like so. Like that. And then loop this coil, continue to loop it around. And I can trim the tail that was wrapped around into the coil and trim the tail from my stitching. Okay, I'm going to do one more stitch across. So I want my thread to pop up over here. So I'm going to stitch over and through the layers at an angle. You can press into something if you want. Pull that through. And now to start the stitching, you'll grab some of the coil from the top here with your needle. Pull through like so and pull tight. Now loop around, and then you'll come to this side and you're going to move over just a bit, put your needle through that initial coil, pull it through and loop around. And now we'll move our gauge up the length of the pine needles, loop the thread around and then up from underneath, about a 1/4 inch away from that last stitch. Pull tight. Now we're starting to see the coil begin to form. And at this point, you're probably going to need to add a few more pine needles. So go ahead and tuck a few into the gauge like so, trying to get them centered into the middle of the bundle of pine needles, like so. And you want to keep that gauge nice and taut or filled so that it doesn't slide around on your pine needles. So again, loop around, come up from underneath, stitch up, pull tight, and this, you may need to move your stitches here as you go to adjust them so that they're somewhat evenly spaced as you work. And I'm going to continue working around the shape. Pushing my needle up and through, and I'm just doing a whip stitch here. This is just a basic stitch to get this coil going. And you can do the entire basket with a whip stitch. That's what I used for my vase basket. Or you can use it for the beginning and change it out for more decorative stitches as you go. So I'm just continuing to coil and stitch around this section that I wrapped the thread around. So I'm kind of using the thread to catch onto that when I pull the needle through. So I'm stitching up in to that coil right here. And I'm trying to catch some of the pine needle in there and also some of the stitching or some of the wraps, and then pull through and around and pull tight to make sure you're cinching that coil nice and tight. And then loop it up and over and then create a new stitch underneath. Turn it over, pull through. Like so. And now we have more of an oval shape going on here. You can work it so that you end up with a circular plate, even if you have an oval shape, by just continuing to wrap and shift the shape or squish the shape out as you're wrapping. Or you can maintain the oval shape again by manipulating the pine needles as you go to maintain the oval shape. So I'll pull through, pull tight, and I'm going to do 2 more stitches and then meet up with where I ended the wrapping. So right here, it's my last section of stitching into where I had the wrapping. So you can see on this side, and I need to add some pine needles here. So from the outside, I'm going to, this is the bottom, bring my stitch around, and my next stitch is going to sit right next to that previous stitch. So I'm bringing my needle right next to that stitch, pushing through, and then if I flip this over, I want it to come through to the other side opposite. So I'm right up next to the stitch on one side on the bottom, and I'm on the opposite side of that stitch to the inside. So I'll pull through and pull tight, and as you curve, slide that stitch over and then pull tight to create the curve. And then that will help you create more of a round shape or more of an oval shape depending on how far over that stitch is. More of a round shape if you push the stitch over further and pull tight. You'll be creating more of a rounded shape than an oval shape. So I'll slide my gauge out a little bit, and I have some ends sticking out here. As I work, I'm going to try to catch those in my stitches so that they don't stick out. So again, on this side, I'm going to come up right into the pine needles, right next to that previous stitch on the bottom, and away from that previous stitch on the top. So it's crisscrossing here, closest to my coil and furthest away from my coil. And pull tight. And again from this other side. And so my stitches end up right up next to each other. And if you do a stitch and you see a piece that stuck out, kind of loosen your stitch and try to catch that pine needle so that you catch it and it lays flush in the coil. And every 2 or 3 stitches you'll add another pine needle or 2 to your gauge to keep it tight. So do another 2 or 3 coils around this base so that from the center wrapped part you have 3 layers out, and then I'll show you a new stitch. As you have a couple rounds or loops around your center point, you'll find that your stitches start to end up further and further apart as your coil grows. So what you'll want to do as that happens is create a stitch in between 2 stitches. So I have a stitch right here and a stitch right here. I'm going to put my needle right in between those to create a new stitching spot so that I have a midway point for a new stitch, and that will end up right there in between these 2 stitches. I have one new stitch right there. And as your piece gets bigger and bigger, you'll need to continue to add those in between stitches as needed. You don't want more than 1/4 inch between stitches for a small basket like this, or else the pine needles will start to pull out or pull away or break. So trying to keep 1/4 inch or less between stitches for this size basket. Now I'm going to show you split stitch. So what we've been doing is creating stitches right next to each other. Now this next stitch, split stitch, is, as it's described, splits the stitch. So we'll bring the needle and you're going to go right into the center of that thread and then up and through the center of the thread on the other side, and then pull through and pull tight. So now right here I've split through that thread, creating a split stitch. So continue putting your needle through the center of the thread and then finding the center of the upper thread. And this one's a little more challenging than the first stitch we did because you're trying to aim for a specific location in the thread rather than just next to it. So again here, right in the center, and then up through the thread. And you can see it looks a little bit different here on the split stitches than it does on the stitches where we went right next to each other. They're lined up a little more. And here I'm putting a stitch in between 2 sections because it's wider apart. And then I'll put a stitch through both sides through that thread. Now I need to add a new piece of twine or thread. So I'll cut off another length. And I like to use about 3 feet to 4 feet in length when I add in a new piece, and then create a square knot close to my coils so that it ends up working into the side of the coil and then into the structure of the basket rather than on top of the basket. So I'll tie that and then trim the ends. Reload my needle. And now when I loop around, that knot ends up sitting on the side of the coil, and so it will get sandwiched into future coils. So continue with the split stitch around the basket at least one round, and then I'll show you the V-stitch. Once you had a chance to practice the split stitch, then you are ready to practice the V-stitch. So here are some V-stitches here. You can see the V-stitches come from the split stitch and then V out from that split stitch. So one leg is here and one leg is here. To create a V-stitch from your split stitches, you're going to come up, do a split stitch like we have been. So my stitch is coming up through the thread here. I'm going to loop this around my coil and flip this over so you can see the back. And now stitch to the far side, or the side away from the direction you're going to. So I'm working left to right. I'm going to go to the left side of the stitch from underneath and the right side of the stitch from up above. I'm not going through the thread here, I'm going right next to it. So the left side on the bottom, coming up on the right side on the top. So it's crisscrossing that thread, and that's going to hold this leg of the V out in this direction. Now loop it around, and from the underneath you're going to do a split stitch into the next stitch. So catch the center of that next stitch, come up the center of that stitch on the top as well, pull through, and that is the second leg of your previous V. So now we're doing the first leg of this next V. So we've created a split stitch. Now flip it over to the left of that split stitch, put your needle up and through, and then come up to the right of the split stitch, not through the split stitch, but just right next to it, and pull through. This is your first V-stitch leg. And now loop it around and split stitch the next stitch over. You may need to slide it over so that it doesn't get caught on the previous stitches. So there's my next V. Again, I've created a split stitch, so I'm going to loop around and come up or press into the pine needles on the left of that stitch that I just split, and then come up through the pine needles on the right of that stitch, pull through, slide the stitch over so that the stitches butt up against each other but they're not overlapped, and pull nice and tight, and then bring it around and split stitch the next stitch over through the top and bottom of the thread, and loop that around, and that's the second leg of your V. So now we'll continue doing V stitches around the base, and once we have one round of V stitches, then we can continue with V stitches, and what you'll do is create your V right between your previous V stitches. So I'll show you that when we get around the basket once and we have that first row of V stitches in place. Now every once in a while come in and press your piece flat against the table to make sure that it's forming flat. In a few rows we'll begin to build up the coil so that we start forming a side for our plate. And we're not going to do it like a bowl necessarily, but just kind of angle the walls out so you get a feel for how to angle a pine needle basket coil so that you can create walls to your baskets, but also just have a little bit so that it's not just a flat coaster. It's a little bit of a wall so that it's not just a flat coaster. And I have taken my pine needles out of the water at this point, and they're sitting on a damp towel so that I can continue to work with them without them being super damp. If they sit in the water for too long, they become too pliable, and they'll start to split really easily as you're doing your stitching, and they won't hold their shape quite as well. So it's a balance of soft enough but not too soft. Once you've gone all the way around your basket with the V-stitch, now you're going to be putting V-stitches in between the two legs of the previous rows of V's. So what that will look like is coming up between two legs of a V, like right here, in between those two, coming up and then around and up into that same hole to create a leg, and then up in between two legs of the next V, and I'm skipping over this space between V's. So you end up going in between every other stitch, essentially. And then back up and through the same hole to create the next leg of the V. So you end up with V stitches building up over each other. So again, I'm going to skip this space between these two stitches and come up in this space right here. So come up in the middle of this space, like so. Pull through, loop it around, and bring my needle up through that same space or the same hole, and then pull tight. And that's one leg formed. And now I'll skip this space in between the V's, come up in between the next V, and that creates the V shape right here between my previous V, but also starts the next V shape. And I'll load more pine needles to fill my gauge. So you come up in the same hole the second time, loop around, come up 2 spaces over or between your next V over. Come up in the same hole, like so. And check to make sure that your piece is forming flat against your work surface. And there I'm forming V stitches layered on top of previous V stitches. When your piece is about 3 inches across, about this shape, you can come in and squish it down to form a circle, or squish it to the sides to maintain the oval shape. And now from here we're going to create some short walls, and I'll show you how to build up the coils to form walls. So we have completed a few V stitches, and now we're going to go back to the simple stitch or the basic stitch, whip stitch, and do some wall building. So I'm going to load my needle with new thread, same thread, just a new piece, and tie this on. And make sure that my gauge is nice and taut, which it is. So now when you go to build the walls of a pine needle basket or start to build up the walls, you're going to lift the coil up and sit it just to the edge of the previous coils, so it sits up like this. And to the outside it would look like this. And now when you do a stitch, you're shifting the location of where your stitch starts and ends, because the stitch will begin to hold the coil in a new place. So I'm going to start forming a wall that just sits slightly up on top of that previous coil. So this outer coil, I want it to sit just kind of kitty corner, propped up on the side of that previous row. So in order to do that, I'm going to lift this guy out of the way, and my next stitch is going to go in between the V stitch, previous V stitch, but rather than right kind of below like I have been doing from underneath, I'm going to lift it so that now my stitch ends up in the side and at an angle. So now my needle is at a 45-degree angle, which means this way, and I'm putting it through the pine needles so that it comes up, maintaining that angle. If my base is flat, maintaining this 45-degree angle, I'll bring it up and around and through and pull tight. And now that new location is lifting the coil upwards like this, so that it's lifting up and I can start to set it on the edge, kind of in the middle of that previous coil. So again, if I come from underneath, right in the side, I'm going to stick my needle to the side and then 45-degree angle, poke up and pull tight. And now that coil is starting to lift and sit on top of that edge. So I'll keep doing it into the side and then angled so that it's closer to the inside of this coil rather than in the middle, and pull tight. And add pine needles as you need to. I'm going to do this tilt up. So I'm shifting where the wall lands up around the basket once, and then do another layer at the same angle around the basket. So we have 2 coils up of kind of an angled wall that'll angle out at a 45 degree. So right in the side, angle out, loop around, and pull tight. And when you've made it around to where you started doing those whip stitches rather than the V stitches, you're going to come in and you can decide whether you want to do just regular whip stitches next to your previous stitch or do split stitches through both sides of your previous stitch. And we're going to continue that 45 degree angle, building the wall, continue to angle it out so that it's forming up and outwards. You can press your piece against the table to flatten it out a bit. So I'm going into the side of the stitch and then up and a little bit more than a 45 degree angle to get my coil so that it sits just to the edge of that previous coil, angled upwards but out, so we're not stacking, we're not making a cup, we're making a plate. You can see my layers are layering outwards, right on top of each other, and this side is curving out and down like so. When your walls are about the height that you want them to be, you can start to taper off the pine needles. So here, the wall over here is about 3 coils high, and I have 2 on this side. I'm going to stop adding pine needles to my gauge and just start finishing off the pine needles that are here, working around the rim. So continue stitching, and if you are stitching and you find that things are kind of loosening up a bit, make sure that you're adding a good amount of tension to your stitching as you work, and you may need to put a stitch in between previous stitches in order to secure things nice and tightly in place. So again, I'm doing split stitch here, going through the previous stitch and then putting a stitch in between my stitches in order to ensure that I have a nice tight bundle there, because that previous row is pretty loose. So putting a stitch there and then coming up into this stitch, and now I'll remove that gauge, and I'm just going to work around, continue working around the bundle of pine needles, tightening down and holding the few that are left to the top of the basket. So we're creating the rim of the basket at this point by doing this. I'm going to go between stitches to finish this off. And now you can continue doing a whip stitch and just whip around what's there and just finish off with the whip stitch in one direction, and then we'll tie it off. Or once you've whip stitched around this last bit of pine needle, then you can go back in the opposite direction and create an X stitch over top of the previous row of stitches to finish off and create more of a distinctive rim. So this is my last stitch. I'll cut the ends in that stitch, and then I can trim these ends down so that they're just poking out a little bit. And now there is my little plate. Now to do the X stitch like I was talking about, I was going around the basket counterclockwise. Now I could go back clockwise and put a stitch into the previous stitch on the outside. So into the same hole here and through to the inside, and then you create a crisscross here. So crisscrossing same hole, creating an X shape to the outside of the basket. And this will just firm things up on the rim of the basket, ensure that it's nice and tight, but it's also decorative. So it adds to the function and stability of the basket, but it also is a decorative stitch. And then I'll take the thread and loop this around one of these stitches and then send the needle through that loop that I just created and cinch it down to create a bit of a knot. And I'll do that on the next stitch over right here. Create a loop and cinch it down, and then loop it into a few of the stitches nearby to hold it in place. And then trim the end down to the inside of the basket. And now while it's still damp, you can shape it a little bit, mold it to the shape you want, set it flat, put something heavy on it to make sure the bottom stays flat as it dries, or just let it dry the way it is. It will dry in the shape that you leave it. So mine ended up oval because I kept that oval shape. Here's the outside. So that's the basics of coiling a pine needle basket and some of the stitches you can use. I still have a lot of my pine needles left, so I've used about half of that initial bundle that I had. So I could make another piece this size or set these aside for another basket. If you're going to be weaving another basket within the next day or two, you can put the damp pine needles wrapped up in your towel into the refrigerator in a Ziploc bag, and they will keep for a new basket for several days. If you're not going to get back to them, go ahead and allow them to dry. It's good to just dampen the amount of pine needles that you need for your current project so that you're not wetting and drying and wetting and drying pine needles over and over again. They become more brittle and more breakable. But if you do have leftovers, that's okay. Just make sure to dry them out thoroughly if you're going to be storing them so that they don't mildew. Or put them in the fridge if you're going to be using them soon. Allow your basket to fully dry. It will take several days to get the pine needles to dry all the way through because of the layering, and especially the center coil, getting that dry through will take multiple days. Allow it to completely dry and then check back. I'll be posting a video soon on how to finish off your basket with beeswax and shellac and other finishing materials. Don't forget to check the description below and my website textileindie.com for more pine needle basket resources and the tools and other videos in this series. You can find those linked below. There are a lot of different shapes you can make with pine needle basketry, so explore and create something of your own or follow along and make this shape with me, and check out my other pine needle basket weaving videos in this series. Thanks for joining me in this tutorial. Until next time, happy pine needle basket making.